welcome back to Switch to Linux. Well, somebody left me a fun comment the other day and asked, what's your thought on Microsoft's guide to install Linux? I was like, I never heard of that. That sounds fun. And so I decided to go ahead and look into this. And one of the things I want to look at is, when was this written? And that could have some interesting discussion as well. Of course, somebody responded to that comment and said, sounds like extend, embrace, extinguish, embrace, extend, extinguish. Something Microsoft does a lot. And people have turned down and said, oh, Microsoft doesn't do it. That's old Microsoft. You haven't seen any evidence that's happening. You see, this is the problem with living in an instant culture that we're in now, is that nobody can look beyond 1 or 2 days anymore, let alone years or decades. And it's because everything in our life is instant. We go to the fast food restaurant and they hand us a cup, and then we go to the soda fountain and we can refill it as much as we want. Realize there was a day you had to take your cup up to the counter to get it refilled. But we're in this microwave instant culture where everything has to be instantaneous. And what happens is people lose the long-term picture. So it's very possible Microsoft is doing this even now, and there seems to be evidence of it. So when was this article written? Well, the article was actually written in September 29th. So we're only about 2 weeks ago is when this article came out, which was hilarious to me because it already has information that's been out of date for a long time, indicating that the people at Microsoft really don't know what's going on in the Linux world. So what is the purpose of this guide? Well, the purpose of this guide, it appears to me after reading it, is a few-fold. The first thought I have is that, well, they're trying to push anybody who might want to tinker with Linux, instead of using the alternative resources like sites and channels like ours, where this is all we do is Linux. I do Linux and privacy and other things related to making your own choices in life. They want you to rely on them and their guides, which gives you a much more narrow focus, because everything is all like, you should use Windows subsystem for Linux on your Windows, or you should use Azure Cloud, or you should just dual boot. But that's kind of annoying because you have to shut down your system to get into that Linux, and you'll lose the resources that you have. And what if you need to write a Word document? Oh my Lord. So that's kind of what I think their goal here is, to get more and more people interested in Linux to look at their resources, which are far more limited and narrow in scope than the broader view. So let's go ahead and walk through the how to download and install Linux guide from Microsoft. This is at learn.microsoft.com/en-us/linux/install. And I think you can go back to just Linux /Linux. So these are the Linux resources. We have install.net. We have install VS Code on Linux. We have install PowerShell on Linux. We have install Edge on Linux. God, why would you want to? We have installed Microsoft Defender for Endpoint on Linux, Azure Linux containers, install Azure CLI on Linux, install Azure PowerShell on Linux, and install Azure Data Studio. So these bottom three are actually assuming you're already on Linux. And then new to Linux, there's here's basically all of these are all those guides. These are just various, everything down here in the how to download and install Linux. They all link to the same page. There's different anchors on that particular page. And then they have, allegedly other resources there as well. So what is our goal here is to get you utilizing Linux as they would want you to. Now, they do have a little bit of completeness here and there, but let's go ahead and have a look. So Linux is an operating system similar to Windows, but with many different versions due to the nature of being open source and fully customizable. To install Linux, you must choose an install method and choose a Linux distribution. The other thing I'd add is, unlike Windows, it doesn't track everything that you do and force you into data collection and require you to be perpetually on the internet and lock everything into an online Microsoft sign-on. So if you are watching this, you're going, oh, I've seen that Microsoft Linux guide. Let's see what some Linux guy thinks about it. The reason about half of us switch to Linux, not all of us, the reason about half of us switch to Linux is to get away of this techno-tyranny that Microsoft, among others, are engaging in order to force you to provide more data collection. Because understand, if you log into your Windows computer with an online Windows ID, everything you do in that system has a much faster, quicker, and long-term pipeline directly into Microsoft. Even though they say you can delete data, your data is your data. It's not really your data. It's on their servers. You can push the delete button, in which case you won't know about it anymore. But if some law enforcement comes up with a warrant to Microsoft and says, give me everything on this guy, even those deleted posts can be restored and handed over by Microsoft. You have to understand that. Even if you didn't do the crime, the problem is people are getting caught up in geofences all the time. And if you get caught up in one of those geofences, you're going to find yourself in a position of trying to prove yourself innocent rather than them proving you guilty by the mere merit that you walked somewhere. Maybe your Android phone was connected to your iCloud or your OneDrive account or whatever else. And so you get caught up in a geofence warrant, and now you're having to defend yourself against some geofence warrant because Microsoft handed over data because it found itself connected to a Google account somewhere. This is happening in real time, by the way. That's why many of us choose to switch. Of course, they just mention, hey, it's similar to Windows, different versions, whatever. It's customizable. So to install Linux, you first choose an install method. So, of course, they prefer the Windows subsystem for Linux, which allows you to install a Linux distribution on your existing Windows computer. They do talk about bare metal Linux, but never wiping out your Windows drive. Oh, no, you won't ever want to do that. You have to dual boot, but that's complicated, so most people don't do that anymore. We should be using WSL or VMs because that's way better. And besides, that keeps your Microsoft system going, and those ones keep your Microsoft account always on. That's what we want. So they talk about VMs to run Linux locally or in the cloud. Of course, they do talk about cloud-based VMs, Azure. Curiously, they leave out like Linode and DigitalOcean, two channel affiliates we have. They also leave out Amazon, which is certainly bigger than Azure. Then we have choose a Linux distribution, Ubuntu, Debian, Kali, OpenSUSE, etc., and then follow steps for your preferred method. And they'll give you a few steps for WSL, VMs in the cloud, VMs locally, and creating a USB to install bare metal Linux. And then after installing Linux, get familiar with your distribution's package manager, update and upgrade the packages available, and get familiar with other Linux resources at Microsoft, such as training courses. But based on how out of date this article already is, even after they wrote it, like before they wrote it, information in this article is already out of date from the time they wrote this. So it tells me they're not really up to date with it, so I'm not sure I'd want to take a course from Microsoft on managing Linux. I'd rather go somewhere else for that one. Linux versions, popular tools, news, and open source events. All right. So choose step one, choose a method to install Linux. So here's their recommendations. Depends on your needs and preferences. New to Linux, we recommend starting with the Windows subsystem for Linux. It's the easiest way to get up and running. Indeed, it very well might be. If you're a Windows user and you're looking to switch to Linux, this may not be a bad place for you to start, so that you can begin experimenting with it a little bit. Just understand that the reason they want you to use that platform instead is because it ties you into Windows and locks certain elements to being on Windows, and you're not going to get nearly as good of an experience on this than you will on a local VM, not your cloud VMs, much harder to use, your local VMs or your bare metal. Those are where you're going to get the real Linux experience. And yes, you can get the real Linux experience in a VM. So, over here, work in a business environment with more complex needs. So this one here, they recommend running a VM in the cloud or checking out support on Azure. Of course, they want to push their products, so that's kind of what they're pushing you to. So if you're like looking up Linux, and I think their goal here is to out SEO a lot of the other guides on Linux that are out there. So maybe all of us in the Linux community, we need to start pushing out our own guides with more up-to-date information so that we can out SEO them. I literally think this is it, so that more people that are searching how to get started with Linux will land here instead of landing on good and real resources that we have. So what they're talking about here is check out the support Azure has to offer. This applies if you want to run Linux as a server. So, of course, these are cloud-based Linux systems, which are a lot different than a desktop. If you're talking about a desktop Linux system, which is mostly what we talk about on this channel, I'd say about maybe 60-70% is that. Running a cloud Linux server is a little bit different in that you're dealing with it more on either a web interface or a CLI. It's a command line interface rather than having a window and display manager. Like this video right now you're watching is recorded entirely on a Linux with a full display manager. In fact, if I can find my desktop view, here you go. Here's actually what we have. This is my whole desktop setup. This is the article I'm reading in, but you know, I'm using OBS, so I can give you these nice, beautiful little layouts here instead. And so really there's two different ways of doing it. I do a number of things with server related things, Nextcloud servers. We do some control panels. We do some VPN stuff. Those types of things we are managing servers. I have a good comprehensive Jellyfin tutorial if you want to learn about making your own cloud-based media server. Things like that is all available. Those are what you'd use Azure for, or I use Linode or DigitalOcean for those. So those are certainly good things there. But the point being here is that they're really pushing you towards their servers, not a global understanding of Linux, which kind of makes sense. They're a company that's trying to make a profit. So we can understand it, but we have to understand looking at a Linux guide on Microsoft.com itself is going to be a little bit more biased. And then number 3 option, do you want to run Linux as your primary operating system? If you're good with slightly more complicated install process, have you tried to install Windows? Really? Installing Linux is nothing like the complexity of installing Windows. You go to install Linux, unless you're doing something like Gentoo, installing Linux is going to be adding USB and pushing the install button. Not exactly complicated, unless you pick some of the weird, obscure things. So if you want a slightly more complicated install process, and you don't need Windows tools like Outlook, Teams, Word, PowerPoint, etc., Word, PowerPoint, LibreOffice, ever hear of it? Of course you have. You just wish it didn't exist because it can completely replace Word and PowerPoint and Excel and Access and all of the other things you want to charge people a monthly fee for that are free in the Linux versions that are equally competent. And then there's also OnlyOffice, there's WPS, there's a few other applications out there. As far as Outlook, well, what do you need Outlook for? Checking your email? We got Thunderbird, we got Evolution, we got Mailspring, we got about 700 other email clients as well. You don't have to use Outlook. Teams, well, you can replace Teams with a good Nextcloud install. That's an option. As far as other functions of Teams, not going to comment too much on it. Can you install Teams with Linux these days? I don't know. I have no idea. Install Teams on Linux. Let's see what happens if we do a little internet search, because I really don't know. Oh, look at this. A Microsoft guide on installing Teams on Linux. So, okay, there you go. Let's see. Okay, I'm sorry. This is from their answers. Let's see. People are actually having the native app running in Linux. Simply get a Windows announcing that Microsoft is still working on it. Here's the accept answer. You can download the package here. Double click on for the package manager. All right, let's have a look at this. See what this looks like. And so this is from 2019. Did Microsoft actually tell us that we can't use Teams on Linux despite having it? Let's see. $4 Teams. What are the classic Teams? What's it charging? Download app for desktop. Let's click on this guy here. Is it doing anything? Go to the download page. I'm sorry, I'm not using a mobile device. Okay, apparently it's not available. I don't know. I have no idea. I'm getting conflicting information here. Let's click the download Teams button up there. That just takes us right back to here. Go to the download page if you're having trouble with a QR code. Using your mobile app, go to here. I'm not using a mobile app. Okay. Well, apparently that's something related to the mobile app. So I have no earthly idea. There apparently is a guide which is talking about it, but isn't. So I don't know. Can you use Teams on Linux? I have no clue. I'm not interested in using Teams. Let me know in the comments down below if you are on Linux and using Teams. Let us know one way or the other. I have no earthly idea. You can run Linux on a bare metal to access the full potential of hardware without any overhead from virtualization or emulation. Okay. So they have their guide here for installing WSL. We're not going to read this guy here. This is just their guide on using it. Simply, you need to boot up your PowerShell with administration. You need to install WSL by doing WSL-install. And then once you have that, then you run your command, which is WSL it's in here somewhere. You're going to be doing a WSL install, and then you need to give it like -D and then give it the distro name. I think that's what it is. I read it in here somewhere, but these pages are so cross-linked in so many different directions. I don't even know where they are. There's so much conflicting information. But anyway, that's your system. As far as creating a VM, if you're using a Windows or Mac, you can create an Azure account. Again, they're pushing you to the Azure account, or they do talk about locally running a VM. And when you're locally running a VM, let's get down to that part there. So type 1 is the hypervisor. Type 2 is things like VirtualBox or VMware. Of course, if you're already on Linux, you can also do GNOME boxes. There's a few other virtualization tools out there as well. Most of the reason you're going to see people do virtualization VirtualBox, the reason for this is VMware does not have a FOSS or a free license. So VirtualBox is the only one of your primary virtualization tools that would allow you in a commercial video to spin up a distribution and show that you're doing it in this. VMware, you'd have to buy a commercial license in order to have any form of YouTube or other related video, because all video on somebody else's platform these days is considered a commercial enterprise. And so you can use VMware for free on your own. You just can't post about it without having the commercial license. They also have the Parallels desktop, which is on Mac, so you can run a variety of things. So here's VM on Mac with the M-Chip series. They have a link to VirtualBox, and then they support both Windows and Mac, and then you're responsible for managing the virtual machine when using the hypervisor, including allocating resources like memory, disk space, things like that. Of course, I have videos about getting started with VirtualBox. Things like that. I think I have some getting started with GNOME boxes as well. So you can do all that. Once you've chosen your Linux distribution and decided whether you want to run a VM locally using a hypervisor or in the cloud using Azure, follow these instructions to create a virtual machine in the cloud or create a virtual machine locally. So again, there's instructions on that. As far as bare metal Linux, this is where it gets interesting, because my idea for bare metal Linux is to wipe that Windows crap out because it's garbage. So bare metal Linux just means running Linux directly on device hardware. This method requires you create a bootable drive by downloading an ISO file from the site hosting your chosen Linux distribution. You'll need to use a Windows computer or any other desktop device with an existing OS to create the drive. That is correct. That is true. You will need to have a functioning computer. You need to go onto the internet, download the ISO, and then what you're going to need to do is burn that ISO onto a drive. They're giving us steps on doing that with Etcher. Here on Linux Mint, I just use the USB writer tool. Depending on your distribution, the way you want to run, this kind of changes up depending on how you're doing it. You just need a way to write an ISO file onto a USB or in some cases onto a CD drive. So many users choose the traditional method of installing bare metal on a device that's also running Linux using the dual boot method, which is something I do not recommend. Even if you're going to have two different operating systems on your computer, I never recommend a dual boot. The reason is because during the system updates, the system might make changes to the boot sector. And if you're Linux and you're making a change to the boot sector, generally it's going to keep everything else intact. But if Windows decides they want to make a change to the boot sector, it will completely wipe out everything Linux and you will not be able to boot into Linux again without doing extra shenanigans that we're not going to go into here. It's possible. It's just going to be a little bit more difficult. Basically, you need to overwrite the boot partition again with Linux grub or something related and tell it to search out all of the operating systems. Now, even some laptops now, you can install multiple hard drives in. If you're doing a desktop computer, you can always install a secondary hard drive in it. I recommend one hard drive per one operating system. Things work out a lot smoother that way. So to dual boot Linux and Windows, you need to partition your hard drive to create separate spaces for both Windows and Linux OS. Performance speed between WLSL, Linux, virtual machines, and bare metal has become so close, few developers choose this method due to the overhead of needing to restart your device every time you want to switch between your operating systems. How tragic that we might actually need to reboot into Windows. Ugh. But if you choose the bare metal Linux install route, you may also need to deal with potential driver or hardware compatibility problems that may arise on Linux on some devices. A little bit of a pot calling the kettle black there, because Linux works way better out of the box than any Windows ever has and still does to this day. Where you try and install Windows on something, this is the difference. Most of you go to the store and buy a computer and it already has Windows installed, and you boot it up and it should work, because the computer manufacturer made sure everything worked. Otherwise, you'd have a really bad experience. If you had to go to the store, though, buy your computer without an operating system and buy Windows, everyone in the world would be using Linux, because Windows is so stinking hard to install. You got to install it. It takes a long time. You have to fight down every single driver. You need to find all the things. Linux, though, has kernel drivers, which manage almost all drivers in it. What are your exceptions? Well, older Broadcom wireless cards, a couple of the brand new cutting edge graphics cards. Linux is not going to handle those super well. But for the average person and the average computer, Linux is going to work infinitely better out of the box. You're not going to have to charge down drivers. I'm sorry, Mr. Article Author, that's Windows you're thinking of, not Linux. And even those that you do have to install external drivers, nearly every Linux distribution now has a good tool to allow you to do that automatically, so you still don't need to chase them down, unlike Windows, which is not particularly good at chasing it down. So that being said, they're a little off here. Of course, they're talking about the dual booting. What they don't mention is that when you install typical Linux distributions, particularly ones they're doing, there is a simple, easy option in most distributions to run alongside your current operating system. You don't need to partition your disk. The Linux installer is going to partition your disk for you. So they're making it sound a lot more complicated, and it's so tragic you need to reboot. Just go ahead and use WSL instead, which isn't going to give you the best true Linux experience either, by the way. But that's kind of what they want to do. All right, so once you are happy, you can go ahead and click the link at linux.org for your best Linux distributions. So over here at linux.org, let's see what they have to say. Oh, come on, linux.org. You guys need to fix your website. Also, update your website. Like CentOS doesn't exist anymore. It's now CentOS Stream, and it's not nearly what it used to be. So, Ubuntu, okay? As much as it's starting to fall in the good graces of popular distributions. Debian, yes. Fedora, yes. Slackware, I'm not sure I'd say it's necessarily a popular distribution. It is a respectable distribution, one of the oldest distributions that still exists, with some of the longest roots. So Slackware definitely reserves a spot on this, but I'm not sure it's super popular. Linux Mint absolutely is popular. Arch, absolutely. Xubuntu, it's an Ubuntu branch. Sure, let's call it good. OpenSUSE, sure, although I think this one's starting to lose out favor, being as that they completely alienated half of their potential audience not long ago, declaring that everybody who happens to have white skin and believe in biology is simply a bad person. Yes, I'm not being facetious. I think I did an alt tech on that. There were things in that video I couldn't say on the tubies. Red Hat for enterprise, yes. Not for the type of Linux we're talking about here. Slackle, can't say I've ever used Slackle. Know nothing about it. Pure OS, not particularly popular. Magia, not particularly popular. PC Linux OS, that's very hard to use. Puppy Linux, a little bit difficult for the new user. Zorin, absolutely worth checking out as a good new user. Bunsen, I believe Bunsen Labs is defunct. If I'm not mistaken, I think Bunsen Labs doesn't exist anymore, or does it? I heard Bunsen Labs went bust. Oh, no, it was Arch Labs. I'm sorry. It was Arch Labs that I think went bust. So Bunsen Labs, okay, yeah. Arch Labs was basically Bunsen Labs Arch Edition versus this is Debian Edition. My apologies. I am fake news. Kubuntu, okay. Manjaro, that's popular. Neptune, I don't remember Neptune being super popular, but okay. Bodhi, not super popular, but definitely has a cool desktop environment. Kali Linux, Netrunner, and Lubuntu. So everything there is somewhat good, except CentOS. CentOS doesn't exist in the current form. That would be CentOS Stream now, a little bit different. So anyway, grab your favorite distribution, and then you need to create a USB install, USB to install the bare metal Linux. They're going to give us to another help guide. Oh, nope, that's on the same thing down here. Wait, where is that? Should be on this exact same page, just down at the bottom. Okay, we'll get down there at the bottom. Where is it? That's it. Okay, so we'll get there. We'll get there eventually. All right, let's see. Where were we at? Okay, so choosing your Linux distribution. Different versions of Linux called distribution. Sometimes shooting to distro. That's correct. There isn't actually a way to just install Linux. Okay, that is correct. Technically, we're installing GNU Linux, not just Linux. So you need to find out which distribution uses the Linux kernel you want to download and install. 600 active Linux distributions. Number of factors. The number of factors in considering your choosing distribution. First is a required Linux experience. So if you're new to Linux, you may want to start with Ubuntu. Not anymore. Again, this is one of those things where it's probably older information. Ubuntu is really losing favor. Now, Microsoft has a lot of fingers in Ubuntu's pots right now. So there's probably reasons they want people to push to Ubuntu. Ubuntu is becoming a lot more difficult to use, a lot more difficult to get installed. It's forcing you to use the snap packages, which isn't as good of an experience. The desktop layout is not super comfortable for somebody. Ubuntu is not a good first place to send somebody. I like Linux Mint, obviously. Zorin is good. Solus might be okay. I'm thinking of the more user-friendly desktop experience on that one. There's other places way better to send somebody than Ubuntu. So they say it is one of the most common places for Linux users to start due to the level of support and ease of use. I would say its ease of use is dropping. Level of support is certainly still there in the community forums. But this is really old information. This was true 5 to 10 years ago. This is not really true anymore. For desktop version, server version, depending on how you plan to use it, this is correct. Arch is popular choice for those who want highly customizable do-it-yourself approach that is still stable and well supported by a large user base. That is true. It is more complicated. That is true. But as far as it is highly customizable, but I think your average person right now isn't just grabbing the Arch distro and installing it with the terminal. I see the average Arch user now using something like Endeavor OS or Arco Linux or things like that. I use Endeavor, of course, on my other system. This one is Linux Mint that we're using here. System requirements, minimal or lightweight distribution means a small footprint with lower memory and processing speed requirements. Alpine Linux is a popular option. Users find with most features disabled or not installed by default. Has everything you need for a containerized app. So that's one of the immutable Linux distributions. I think we looked at Alpine. I can't remember. Security needs. So you might need more security type stuff. You have Kali Linux for pen testing and things like that. So they're talking about that. Reverse engineering, computer forensics work. Business and enterprise, this one, they steer you to Red Hat, which is correct, Oracle, which is correct, or CentOS, incorrect. Not really existing anymore, not the place where you send somebody to get an alternative to Red Hat. Nowadays, you should be talking about Alma Linux or Rocky Linux if you're looking at that approach. So you can see this is yet another case where the article is a little out of date despite it's only 14, 15 days old at this point in time. Whoops, I accidentally just clicked the button over there. Let me click back over here. So CentOS, again, the person who wrote this is not up to date on Linux, which is kind of frightening. Community support, larger user community that consistently contributes to the distribution, fixing bugs, adding features, helping with questions, and another good consideration. Ubuntu is one of the most popular distributions. I completely agree. Ubuntu's help guide is good. And the good thing is Ubuntu's help guide will even help against most issues you have in Debian at large or any other Debian-based distros like Linux Mint, like Zorin OS, and about 700,000 other Linux distributions. OpenSUSE has been around longer, still receives active updates. The problem with OpenSUSE is it doesn't have as big of a help guide to help you solve a lot of issues. So that is the problem. The Linux.org site has resources to help you assess what's available. Linux.org is not a place to go. Okay, Linux.org has become a corporate behemoth funded by Google and Microsoft for their purposes. Linux.org is not necessarily a good place to go with Linux. You want to spend some time on Linux channels like this one and other Linux YouTubers that are out there, and maybe reading some other Linux blogs, things that are not tied to the corporate, but more on the ground resources. Those are way better. Don't go to Linux.org, especially since Linux.org, they probably changed at this point in time, but at one point in time, Linux.org got so kind of crazy that even on their, according to their own guide, of course they have a bad site, so I probably can't find any more. When you downloaded, when you issued support over to Linux.org, when you went and made a financial contribution, it was specifically on the footer of their page. I covered videos on this at the time. Other people did as well. You might have to find it on archive.org or something like that. But they literally had any donations made to the Linux Foundation, or is it Linux.org or Linux Foundation? It's one of those two, goes to diversity and inclusion initiatives. I thought it was contributing to Linux. I guess not. I don't know. So community support is good. Ubuntu does have one of the best community supports. Linux Mint has good community support. Debian has good community support. Arch has good community support if you can get past the people telling you to do RTFM. So, which is read the blanking manual. If you ever hear that one. If someone ever tells you that, it means that, yeah. There are other guides out there. So as far as installing methods, here's where it was. Install wsl-install-d and give the name of the distro. And that's how to install it on WSL. Then they talk about cloud. Here's all the Azure stuff. They talk about locally using Windows Hyper-V, VirtualBox, or VMware. Okay, that's all useful information. And then create the bootable USB drive to install on bare metal. So they talked about downloading the file. And then there is direct links to Ubuntu. So you know that they're working hand in hand with Ubuntu here, providing direct links to the people they're supporting. No links to other better resources where they're not. Creating the USB drive, you'll typically need a USB drive with at least 16 gigs of space. You'll need software to create the bootable drive, many options, Balena Etcher, Rufus, NetBootin', etc. So yes, and then check the download site for a distribution. We'll recommend the startup creator to use. Some of them will have their own startup creators. Tails is one that comes to my mind off the top. So boot your device from the USB drive. When restarting the device, you need to enter the boot menu. This is typically done by holding down the F12 key during setup. It's either F12, F11, or F9. F9, typically HP computers. F11 is your MSI boards. Wow, MSN, wow. MSI boards. F12, most other ones, Dell's are F12. A lot of other ones. Default is F12. Otherwise, it could be F11 or F9. So that's correct. And then you can select the USB drive containing your distribution. Now, the thing they're mentioning here is you might need to disable secure boot. Now, if you're doing like Ubuntu, Linux Mint, Debian, I think Fedora secure boot enable as well. You can still boot with those. A lot of other distributions, you may need to disable secure boot in order to do that. They don't tell us that. Again, outdated information. Select install options, find the installer. And then finally, with the Linux distribution, ask for the username and password. And then after installing it, get familiar with how to run your system. So in this case, we're talking about Ubuntu uses apt. And then there's other information about how to upgrade your packages, again, with Ubuntu. And then finally, go to other Linux resources available at Microsoft to learn more completely outdated and somewhat useless information that we have available on Linux. Including how to install all of our tracking code and all the other nonsense that you're probably wanting to use Linux to escape. Now, to be fair, about half the people using Linux are using it because they're developers. They don't really care or know much about the privacy, security elements of things. They're just, okay, I have work to do. What's the easiest way to get things done? A VM or WSL certainly is the better way to go if that is you. But if you are the other half of the crowd that's like, I am really sick of the invasive tentacles that Windows is forcing into my life through pushing their nonsense in the operating system, forcing me to use an online accounts and things like that, this is where wiping your Windows altogether and switching to Linux is the better option. Now, I will warn you, though, do not do that right away out of the box. In other words, don't decide tomorrow, I really want to use Linux. Let's download this stuff and install it and wipe out my Windows computer and be done with it. I always recommend a slow roll approach. Either get a second hard drive, a USB drive, an external hard drive, or a secondary computer. Tinker around with Linux, spend some time tinkering around with Linux, migrate your data over there, figure out the tools and the software you need, and then eventually you can make that final switch. The reason you don't want to jump off right away is because there might be something you need on that old system. There may be some workflow you haven't figured out yet. There may be some tools you still need some learning with and you need some training with. You do not want to shoot yourself in the foot and be without a computer for a little bit because you made the jump too quick to Linux. So definitely consider that. But there was our thoughts and the analysis of the Microsoft's guide to installing Linux. It has some outdated information. It has some correct information. Overall, I would probably steer you towards other guides instead. You'd have a much better time finding a random video or a blog site dedicated to Linux rather than Microsoft, which pushes their company, their corporate, their data collection, their operating system, and their tools on you, because they're going to be certainly a biased position. Is this some form of embrace, extend, extinguish? I'm leaning in that general direction, yes, because they're giving us information that's slightly out of date but will work just enough to get you more and more tied specifically to using Linux through their operating system, which cripples you to using Linux when you're not on their operating system. That's my final thought and analysis. Let me know your thoughts about all this in the comments down below. Thank you for watching this video from Switched to Linux. This channel would not be possible without the backing of the program supporters scrolling on the screen now. You can be a supporter at Patreon at patreon.com/TOMM or at thinklifemedia.com. I also want to thank the open source community who creates such excellent software that makes producing this show possible. Please remember to support your software communities. Thank you, and I hope that you enjoy switching to Linux.